Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Cristina Velez. I'm a senior instructional designer with Creighton University. Creighton is their main campus is located in Omaha, Nebraska, but as I am a fully remote employee, I work and live in Florida. So get to enjoy some beautiful sunny weather today. Um, my presentation is looking at the learning sciences and the pedagogy of care. Um, if you have any questions, please feel free to pipe up or write in chat. I cannot see the chat, just so everyone is aware, but I definitely welcome a discussion type of format with this presentation. Okay, so the purpose of this session is to look at real-world course design because that has more to do with better learning outcomes with students rather than kind of thinking high-level overall design. We're going to talk about some metacognition and retention strategies to improve student learning. And I'll share some strategies and tips to increase participation and engagement with students. Okay, so the objectives. Hopefully, after this session, you'll be able to identify and analyze some connections between different learning sciences concepts to create materials that encourage that student engagement. Evaluate and model. I'm going to evaluate and model the impact of pedagogy of care framework on student curiosity and engagement. Because the pedagogy of care, I'm using that as the backbone or framework for this presentation. I'm going to share some examples of different learning activities.
Christina, I'm sorry, we're getting told that they can't see your slides. I'm able to see them, but I guess the others aren't. Maybe I
Oh,
need to do something different here. One second.
okay.
We can see them. It's just the poll is taking up a much bigger space
Oh,
and the slides are just in a teeny tiny corner.
oh, perfect. Thank you
Oh,
for that clarification.
thank you. I will change my screen then. We'll do it this way. Is that better?
No, we're still just seeing what it hasn't changed.
Okay. I'll stop sharing for a second then. I appreciate your patience.
It's called technology.
Yes.
Yes, we do love technology, just when it doesn't work right. Some of the comments coming through.
Yes. And
There
this
we
is the first
go.
day.
Now I see the objectives. Does everybody else see that as well? Super, super. Okay, Christina, continue.
Thank you. Thank you again also for your patience. It's the first day, right? Got to get the hiccups out. So anyway, as I was saying with the objectives, gonna identify and analyze some facets of the learning sciences field. I'm going to be using the pedagogy of care as a framework or backbone for this presentation. Later, I will share some examples of different learning activities that may impact and hopefully increase student curiosity and engagement. And at the end of this presentation, there will be some time and opportunity to apply the concepts that we're discussing today. If you all want to share how you might incorporate these concepts into your own learning materials um, when designing your courses. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so here's a poll. Please feel free, if you'd like, to scan the QR code or go to vvox.com and enter the code on the bottom right. If you don't want to participate in the poll, that's okay too. You can simply answer the questions from the poll in the chat of the Zoom. But I'm going to bring up the actual poll real quick. So if you're scanning the code, just give me a moment, please. Okay, so here's your code and the QR code. So you can continue scanning that. Okay. So the first question that I'm asking is whether you're familiar with the learning sciences field. Seeing some great numbers here. Okay. Pretty much what I suspected, so that's great. Oh, we're getting some more. Okay.
And there is nothing in the chat, so everybody must be going into the
Perfect.
poll. At least not yet. I don't see anything in the chat.
That's quite all right. Okay. So these are great numbers. I'm glad to hear that a good number of you are familiar with at least some parts of the learning sciences field. I'll get into a little bit of the history in just a moment. So then the next question, you can go ahead and close that. The next question is, what's a word or two that comes to mind to describe the pedagogy of care framework if you're familiar with it? And if you're not, take a guess. Compassion, great. Relational, yes. Definitely. Psychological safety, empathy, meaning making. Nice. Holistic, whole person, human-centered. Kindness, trust. Definitely. These are all great perceptions of pedagogy of care.
In the comments, we have human-centered, belonging, and learner-centered.
Yes, definitely. So I'm not sure if any of you were in the morning wake up session, but I appreciated that the facilitators of this conference are including sessions that are not just AI focused, but also human focused. So that is pretty much what my session is going to be focusing on today. So I love all these words and perceptions of pedagogy of care, and you all are correct. Pedagogy of care is pretty much a framework that looks at, students as a whole person. And we're going to go into some strategies to help students feel like they are welcome in your classroom, whether you teach online or in person, or if you're training adults versus K-12 students. A lot of these activities can be used in multiple formats. Okay, so I'm going to close that and go back over to my slides. Okay. So learning science versus sciences of learning. They are two different fields, even though a lot of people use the terminology kind of interchangeably. So learning science looks at the real world application of how learning is happening. Okay. Sciences of learning is more focused on kind of the how the learning is happening inside your brain. So it often starts off in a lab experiment for the sciences of learning. Um, the sciences of learning also looks at how the brain works. So you think about, neuroscience, psychology, sociology, that kind of thing. The learning science, however, and that's what today's session is focusing on, is focusing on how learning happens in real life settings. So you're getting outside that lab environment and looking at classrooms, museums, workforce, so where the learning is actually taking place. Learning science is generally rooted in Piaget's constructivism and Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. So you'll probably be very familiar with a lot of the concepts that learning science talks about. So the reason why there's kind of two separate I don't want to say fields, but they do consider learning sciences versus science of learning is because often researchers and practitioners did not always communicate and collaborate. And I know that's something, at least in the instructional design world, that's something that we're trying to improve, right? We're trying to get more researchers to collaborate with practitioners to see how theories actually work in the real world of classrooms. So the 4 central themes to learning science is trying to bridge that research and practice. Because researchers often focus on specific circumstances and environments, sometimes theories don't always work across the board, right? So let's say researchers do a lot of experiments, they gather a lot of data, and it's wonderful data, but it only really works in 1 or 2 instances or in online learning versus traditional in-person learning. That's where the bridge between the practitioner and the researcher comes in. Because then the practitioner can go, hey, you know, does this theory work in my classroom? And if it doesn't, what can we do to adapt it and make it better and improve it for the needs of my students? So the design principles that are rooted in those theories tend to be consistent, empirically tested, and based on how the brain interprets learning. So that's where you get the neuroscience and the psychology aspects being implemented into those classrooms. And limitation occurs because theories of cognition are descriptive of learning and performance, not prescriptive of the instruction needed to foster that learning. What I mean by that is the theory of cognition sometimes doesn't take into account that human element of learning. So while data may show that the brain interprets stimuli a certain way, kind of across the board, all brains do that, how the person recalls or applies that information will be different depending on who's learning in that particular situation. So keeping in mind the limitations between theory and real world can offer innovative design solutions for learners. Basically, meet learners where they are and then create activities to scaffold them to where they need to be. So this leads into emphasizing learning and behavior of the individual, and then tailoring the learning situation to meet those needs. An example that I have is I at one point in my life was an adjunct instructor at a community college, and I used to teach developmental writing skills. And so in my one in-person classroom, I might have 18-year-old students just graduated from high school, learning right alongside those adult learners that, you know, are coming back into the classroom to relearn for a new career. So I used to call it a one-room schoolhouse type of situation. So what would work for the just graduated students wouldn't always work for the coming back into the classroom students. So being able to kind of juggle the different needs of the students leans very much into this learning science and eventually the pedagogy of care. Okay. So learning science approaches. So this basically means how do we use learning science, right, in the real world? I keep saying real world. So you need to consider prior knowledge. So prior knowledge includes skills, experiences, and beliefs that impact learning. So it's not just, oh, I learned this concept in high school and I still remember how to do it, and I'm just going to keep applying that bit of knowledge or that skill set. It's also what experiences and beliefs has that student encountered during their academic years that may impact how they perceive your information or your classroom. Prior knowledge of content is usually what we consider it's most easily inferred or assessed. So like I said, you know, math skills or reading skills or writing skills. Prior knowledge of intellectual skills, however, are often considered soft skills. They are skills that we don't always consider when teaching students, especially at the higher levels in higher ed or training, corporate training. These are things like how does the learner process information? How does the learner communicate that information? Or be able to objectively reason that information? I was working with a faculty member who has noticed a lot of her sophomore and junior students are having a little bit of trouble with study habits. So she's considering, you know, how can she help her students get to the level they need to be successful? So that's, prior knowledge. Incorporating and encouraging students to refer to past experiences when problem solving helps bolster students' believe that their knowledge is beneficial. And sometimes, if students don't believe that their prior knowledge is useful, it can create negative biases, which then just kind of rolls down the hill and gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then just really limits students on their engagement and curiosity and how they approach learning. So I'm sure we all have heard of Skinner in the 50s and 60s. He was a big proponent of errorless learning and recommended small, specific scaffolding steps to prevent students from making mistakes. So I'm not the biggest fan of that concept. A lot of us do not like to make errors or mistakes, especially in public environments, get rosy-cheeked from embarrassment. And I've been there. However, by allowing room for mistakes, it helps students to feel challenged, and it will then help them to consider the information or materials in a different way. And it usually does help them to recall that information applied to other situations easier. So encouraging those moments of error helps students to rise to the occasion, and it makes learning more efficient. So it's not learning versus performance. You're not asking students to perform the material, you're asking them to learn the actual material. Clear and constructive feedback is probably something everyone has heard for so many years, but it really is very, very important. And learning sciences very much emphasizes that the constructive and clear feedback can do wonders for students, but that feedback should be more individualized. So instead of saying, oh, group A of students did a really great job, it should be, well, student 1 did this particularly well, student 2 did this particularly well in their group. So providing that specific feedback helps students to grow and maybe meet those challenges. Multimodal and multimedia instruction, it's something that is not really a new concept anymore, but having different ways to deliver your information and for students to show that they've learned really helps to keep the brain flexible and helps them to kind of see the material in different perspectives. This leads me into the idea of spacing of study and practice. So I'm sure I've been guilty of this, of procrastinating and waiting to the last minute to try to either study for a test or to try and finish some sort of project. And that's very bad for the brain. We hear this all the time. However, creating purposeful spaces of study and practice for students can really help them to interpret the concepts that you're trying to teach, and gives the brain just an extra little breath or pause to fully store that information into long-term memory. Providing instances of demonstrations, scaffolding, and practice really helps for the students to, helps students to be able to show what they've learned. So often we talk about using Bloom's taxonomy as kind of the gold standard for creating those objectives and learning activities. And that's great because it focuses on how students can show that they've learned, but that's kind of the trick here, is that they have to show it. And all learning does not occur that way. Some learning just sort of happens in the brain, and there's no real way to demonstrate that. So creating instances of scaffolding and practice and just pausing helps students to kind of think about information in slightly different ways. Brain plasticity is a term that is, I think, really cool. So basically, relational memory occurs when students learn something that adds to what they already have mastered. This means that the brain is constantly evolving and adapting and changing. From the moment you're born, it's getting a whole bunch of stimuli and information, and your neurons are making those connections and storing them in long-term memory and all that. Um, uh, which is great. But then when you're considering how do you apply that in the classroom, you need to purposefully ask students to kind of use their brains in a slightly different way. So if you remember that the brain is constantly changing, you can consider that even if a student is a bit hesitant, for example, to try something new, uh, meeting that challenge and rising to the occasion will actually help them to remember the concepts easier. I know I'm kind of throwing a lot at you. Does anyone have any questions so far?
There is nothing in the chat at this time.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so talked about the learning sciences, right? And that's the sciencey side of the session. Now I'm going to talk about the human side of the session, pedagogy of care. So late 80s, early 90s, Nell Noddings came up with this concept of pedagogy of care after questioning how learning would be different if the entire process followed principles of caring and ethics. And that word cloud that you all made is a wonderful example of this. Learning does not occur or should not occur in a silo. It's meant to be human, and it's meant to create those connections between humans. Pedagogy of care embraces critical pedagogy, culturally responsive pedagogy, trauma-informed pedagogy, and feminist pedagogy. I'm a little hesitant to include that feminist pedagogy there at the end, just because I don't want to make pedagogy of care too specific, just because we're all so different in terms of how we perceive the world, how we perceive information. So I like to focus more on how can we make sure learning is occurring in a way that students feel okay and that they feel welcomed to try and make those mistakes and be challenged. So I like to more think about pedagogy of care as culturally responsive. How does this work in the real world? So a lot of this has to do with acknowledging students as individual entities or human beings. I work for Creighton University, which is a Jesuit Catholic university, and one of our core tenets is this idea that, we have to think about students as a whole person, which is wonderful. It ties very much into pedagogy of care because we need to make sure that students feel like they can connect with one another, with faculty, with staff, and then obviously with course concepts. So pedagogy of care, it works well in online asynchronous discussions by increasing engagement with the material, but there's some tips for that. You have to be very responsive and proactive with how posts are done, what prompts are done. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of online discussion boards a little bit later. But at the end of the day, you want to really just utilize open-ended learning situations because those open-ended questions, case studies, scenario-based learning, collaborative work with specific group roles, that all of those encourage students to make learning their own, to feel that they control their own learning process. And this then leads to metacognition of the course concepts and how they relate to the learner's lived experiences. So kind of going back to that prior knowledge or prior skills and then applying them to the new learning concepts. Also, obviously, pedagogy of care will foster creativity, critical thinking, and then application. I think I'm starting to talk a little bit too fast. Okay, so designing learning materials. So here I have just some sample learning materials that usually are in most, at least online courses. But again, this can work for traditional face-to-face coursework, training programs, even if it's something completely not education focused. But discussion boards, obviously would equate to any type of communication mode. You want to consider maybe assigning roles to students. So if they're put into groups, perhaps Student A can be the facilitator or the leader. Student B can be a summarizer. Student C could be the fact checker. By providing students authority, I guess, and giving them a role, you're helping them to take ownership of their own learning process. And that pretty much is the essence of pedagogy of care is helping students to feel like they are welcome, to feel like they belong, and to obviously feel that their learning process is important and that they are important in the classroom. When designing writing assignments, that's kind of, everyone does this, except maybe math, but no, I'm just kidding. Of course, I do not have a math background. So writing assignments is kind of my bread and butter. I'm used to helping faculty design those. But when you're designing them, consider using broad topics. So if you're teaching a course about social justice, for example, and the students need to write some kind of paper on a current topic, keep the topic broad or give them a choice of topic. Sometimes just providing the opportunity for choice helps students to consider your concepts in a different light. And really that helps for critical thinking and critical reflection and all that good stuff. Another idea to keep in mind is to consider peer review, but include examples of what an effective review looks like. So if you're asking students to peer review one another's writing work, that's great. That fosters that collaboration and critical thought. But if they've never experienced a really good, effective review by another peer, they're not going to know how to do one, how to write one. So at the beginning of class, I always encourage faculty I help, consider including examples because sometimes that's all a student needs is some kind of example to start off with, and then they know what you're looking for and what to do to meet the criteria to be successful. Also, I encourage faculty I help to include some kind of self-reflection with writing assignments and group work. Just because self-reflection helps the student to pause, take a moment, and really consider, did they learn during this assignment? What did they learn? How they can apply it? And it helps to give faculty like a little window into how the student is perceiving the information. This is also a good opportunity to do a quick check-in or temperature check of your students. If you're noticing that a lot of students are not meeting your standards or not understanding the material well, that's a really great opportunity to take a step back and reassess, well, is it the material that they're not understanding or the delivery mode that you're using for that material? Because sometimes that's all it takes, is that students just need a different way to see or interpret that material. I would recommend, if you're going to use self-reflection, to consider doing 2 self-reflection points, one during a draft phase and then the other at the end. But keep those reflection prompts different, because when a student is working on a draft of their assignment, how they're thinking about the assignment is very different than how they're thinking about the assignment at the very end. So consider using different prompts for those reflections. And that's also a great pause point for faculty as well, to make sure that the students are understanding the material and that they're able to apply the material. Okay, group work. I am definitely one of those that is not the biggest fan of group work in the traditional way it's been used. Group work does not have to be anxiety inducing or stressful or or anything like that. We can make group work assignments be enjoyable and beneficial and constructive. One of the ways to do that is to assign students roles. And yes, I'm repeating myself from the discussion board, but I do think it's important to have students feel like they have ownership of their own learning. And if students have roles, so Perhaps one of the students might be a data collector. Another one might be the primary editor, especially if they're really good at it or enjoy it, or workload manager. That also helps create accountability for the students in the group. So that dreaded, one person does all the work thing doesn't have to happen. Creating expectations and clear boundaries for group work is also another strategy. Um, I recommend grouping students that have common interests. So kind of back to that sociology paper or example or social justice paper. If the topic is to write about a current event, perhaps group the students based off of the actual event. That way they already have a connection, so they can feel like they can work well a little easier with their group members. But also common interest just sort of naturally help students to talk to one another and to feel trust in one another. So grouping students with common interests will usually increase the likelihood of student engagement and then fair workload, because that's always the other concern, is making sure that every student in the group has an equal and fair amount of work to complete. This leads me into the suggestion that maybe group members should create a project management plan. And that's a term that's big in instructional design. And anyone that has ever led large scale or projects that have many moving parts all at the same time. A project management plan basically includes, what the end goal is, what's that tangible thing that this group is going to finish, any sort of milestones or how they might celebrate reaching them, clear designation of duties and responsibilities, and a method or strategy for group members to provide feedback to one another. The plan should also include what happens if a group member does not adhere to those agreed upon duties and responsibilities. I think that is probably the most important part of the project management plan, because having that accountability helps students to remember that they are responsible for different parts of this project. And if everyone has that clear expectation from the beginning, it will help alleviate any sort of confusion or disagreement along the way. I always also encourage some sort of reflection on themselves and also how their group worked. So this helps to create kind of a balance, because especially if the group is being graded as a whole instead of individually, this helps students to feel like they can prove what they did. And it's also nice to be able to see how students work together, what they considered, how they communicated, because that's big. That's another one of those soft skills that everyone, including myself, needs to work on all the time. So having that role and accountability, and especially the clear expectations of what needs to be done when, really helps students to consider the learning process, how it applies to them, and how they can apply these skills and concepts in the real world later on. Multimodal projects, this is the idea that students don't have to deliver the same exact final thing to prove that they've learned. So I know I talked about written assignments, but perhaps instead of everyone needing to do a written assignment, the final tangible or the final thing that is being delivered could be a video or a play or a blog or comic strip or I don't know, lots of other different types of things that show the learning has occurred. They have critically analyzed the core concepts of your course, and they can apply it and deliver it to you. Allowing some flexibility on the creativity really helps students feel like that they are being encouraged to try. And if it doesn't work out, then they can pivot and learn flexibility in the real world. Um, I, I'm a I like when I was in school, I liked doing writing assignments, but sometimes it was a little nice to try doing something else. So if the objective of the final project has nothing to do with writing skills, that might be a good opportunity to consider allowing students to create different things at the end. So how do you assess that, right? Rubrics are kind of the first thing that faculty use as a measure of assessment. And they're great. Rubrics are wonderful if they're designed well and effectively. Rubrics need to be clear. They need to communicate what you're looking for, but they also still need to be a bit flexible. So as long as the criteria aligns with the course objectives, obviously, but also has a bit of breathing room so students can get creative with their project, that will help students to consider the different course concepts and obviously their own learning process in a different way. So keep your rubric criteria written in such a way so that the criteria focuses on the content of the project and how well learning mastery is shown, not so much on the design of the product, unless, again, that's the objective of the course. So, for example, a colleague of mine was telling me the story that her students, or sorry, her children were asked to do a spelling test. So the students in the classroom were practicing all week, verbally spelling out the words. When Friday rolled around, test day, the students were asked to get a piece of paper, get their pencil out, and begin with instructions that said, write your name, write your date, number the paper 1 through, I think it was 15, and then write out the spelling of the words. Now, at first glance, that doesn't seem that big of a deal, but if students had spent the entire week verbally practicing how to spell, the assessment wasn't clearly assessing the skill that needed to happen, right? Because the skill that needed to be shown was that the students knew how to spell the words. But asking the students to take the paper out, asking them to write down from a set of instructions was adding extra barriers for them to prove that they knew what they were doing. So having rubrics that have that flexibility on the creativity part will help students make sure that they're aligning to your objectives and to the core concepts. And finally, reflection. I had mentioned this earlier, but reflection really is key. Self-reflection, it really should be incorporated into more aspects of the learning process. I'm not saying that students need to be constantly thinking of me and I all the time, but checking in with yourself to make sure that you're understanding the material correctly and you're able to apply it in different instances correctly and critically, that's how learning happens. And that's how learning sticks with you, is being challenged with different scenarios and being asked to prove that you know what you're doing in different ways. And reflections can be very simple. They can be a quick little poll, a temperature check, or a check-in with your students at the beginning or end of class. Or it could just be a simple like, hey, write me a note, email me if you have questions. It doesn't have to be an in-depth reflection to get a better picture of how your students are doing. Okay, so again, I know I'm kind of talking a little fast and I'm trying to work on that, but here's pretty much a summary of what I discussed. So starting off, flipping the concepts, starting off with pedagogy of care. It recognizes the humanity of and attends to the holistic needs of both student and instructor. I know I did not mention this throughout, but it's also taking care of yourself as an instructor, right? I know that planning different activities that incorporate creativity or multimodal delivery formats takes a lot. It takes a lot of consideration, a lot of planning. You have to consider, are my standards being met? Am I meeting the needs of all of the students? So I completely understand. and you definitely need to take care of yourself as well. But that it just means planning at the end of the day. Uh, but when as you incorporate the concepts of pedagogy of care a little bit more into your course design, it gets easier, it gets faster. And of course, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, as the phrase goes. You can always, you know, talk to your colleagues, or if you have access to instructional designers, talk to them. I love it when faculty come and ask me questions for designing learning activities. Um, so the pedagogy of care also promotes enhanced access to material and resources, relationship building, and effective learning objectives. And that leans heavy into accessibility and UDL. And by accessibility, I don't just mean obviously making sure that your content is accessible, especially according to the new stricter guidelines. It's also making sure that your materials and resources reflect the greater world. So pulling videos or readings or articles or even guest lectures from different perspectives. I'm not going to say you need to have them be diverse, but consider different opinions and different people's experiences and how they approach your course concepts. Diversity of content and showing mastery, and that's just, a little D diversity, just again, keeping things varied, keeping them creative, different, incorporating, you know, the real world. For example, Omaha, Nebraska is a city, a large city, and our university pairs partners with a lot of local city organizations who help students get out in the real world, volunteer their time, learn about people. And I think that's wonderful. I think that would help pretty much any field or any course, I should say, discipline, because then the students can see how to apply what they're learning in different environments. It's not just inside the classroom. It's also, if you're training to be a lawyer, what does that actually look like in an office with a client or a judge? Things like that. Of course, pedagogy of care encourages collaboration, talking with others. Again, learning should not happen in a silo or solo event. It should happen with others. Um, and then, of course, meeting students where they are and then scaffold them to higher levels. So by that, I just mean recognizing that you have a group of students, whether you're teaching a very traditional in-person K-12 small classroom, or you're teaching, graduate students that come from all walks of life with lots of different lived experiences, recognizing that they're individuals, but they're here for a reason. They're in your classroom for a reason, whether it's because they want to better themselves, which is always great, self-motivation, or if they have to, which it happens. But by incorporating different types of learning activities and encouraging creativity, that usually helps students get more engaged and feel more part of your class. So then how does that tie into learning of sciences? Really leaning into that prior knowledge skill set of students, the skills that they've learned in school, the experiences that they have in life, and those softer skills of, communication, interpretation, critically applying what they know, being able to make judgment calls based off of facts that you can go find in reputable sources, right? Learning sciences also teaches us about cognitive load and metacognition. And I didn't talk too much about cognitive load, but that has to do with putting too much on the student at once. So having those pause moments in your course to let students practice, go back to the original material. This works very well in an online environment because students can just go back to the prior modules. So in-person traditional classrooms, you have to be a little bit more purposeful in reviewing materials and giving students that opportunity to review those materials. And finally, metacognition reflection, helps students to recall what they learned and be able to apply to themselves and to others. And I know I have about 5 minutes left, but I did have one more slide. If If anyone would like to come off mute or write in the chat to just quick discussion, or even if you have questions, what activities have you tried that align with learning sciences and pedagogy of care? Or what activities might you want to adopt and try in your course? And of course, are there any barriers or challenges that you can immediately think of if you're going to try to incorporate pedagogy of care and learning sciences? I would love to hear from all of you, or at least some of you. So please feel free to come off mute and discuss.
We have one comment saying from Stephanie Wilson, the group work PM plan is a great idea.
Hey,
Yes.
Christina.
Mhm.
I feel like one of the barriers that we face, I'm at an R1 institution, and there's always a conversation about how if a space is human-centered and rigorous, it can't be rigorous. If it's caring, it can't be rigorous. And
Mhm.
I'm like, I don't understand why these things are separate. They can totally be. All the examples that you shared require immense critical thinking from students. So it's really helping other educators like come to terms with spaces that can be caring while also meeting learning objectives.
Yes, definitely. And I'm thankful that you brought that up because I do hear that a lot as well. Creighton is trying to be like that, and it's great to be research based. However, being caring and caring about your students does not make your teaching less effective. I think if you make those connections and help students make connections and collaborate and work together, that only improves learning and it improves teaching as well.
You got a good job from Ursula Sorensen in the comments. So
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and take it off record in case anybody that has a question doesn't want to be recorded. So we're kind to them as well. So